So when we talk about learner engagement, this has come up a couple of times in our conversation already today. The idea, what learner engagement means is that the learners are actively involved in the learning process. If you, if you're talking and they're listening for a long period of time, that's not really engagement. You need to do things to kind of get them involved. Why is learner engagement important? Well, for one thing, if the learners are not paying attention, they're not going to learn. And so the idea is to get them engaged, help them focus and pay attention to what you're teaching them so that they can actually learn it. The second reason is because by engaging with concepts and ideas, learners make connections between what they're learning and what they already know. Practice activities are designed to help learners engage with concepts and ideas that they're learning about. So it's that way of helping them learn and think about what they're learning. And then the final thing is that it helps them expand their personal mental models. Now, a mental model, if you're not familiar with that term, it's really the construct in your mind about things that you know about. All right. So if you're not like I'm not an expert in land access, so my mental model about land access is only so big and so complex. You guys are much more of experts in that way. So your mental models are more complex. You've learned a lot more. You have a lot more complexity to that mental model. So that's really what learning is all about. And as you engage students in learning, that's how they expand that mental model. It becomes more complex and they have a more higher level understanding about what you're learning about. So those are the reasons why learner engagement is so important. If you can think for a minute and you can just, just think about a time the last time that you can think of, something as recent as you can think of, that you facilitated or participated in a training session. How did you or the other trainer allocate the time with learners? Okay, think about that for a minute. Maybe you took a course or of some sort or some kind of a training session. If you think about how much time you were involved in the training session or something that you trained, how did you spend that time? Think about the kinds of activities that you did or how you spent most of the time when you were doing that training. And the reason for thinking about that is because with this idea of engagement, depending on the kinds of activities that you do, they'll be more effective in fostering learning. And you may have seen this before. It's called the cone of learning. A man named Edgar Dale back in the 60s did some research about how people learned and what they remembered and how different types of activities impacted what students learned and remembered. There's been a lot of research since then that has pretty much reinforced these things and added all kinds of additional depth to it. But the gist of it is, according to his research, if somebody read something and that was it, a couple weeks later, they remembered about 10% of that based on his studies. If they actually heard words, were hearing something about it, they remembered a little bit more. If they saw something like a visual, then they tended to remember a little bit more than that. If they did something a little more complex, like seeing and hearing, then they tended to remember like 50% of what they had seen and heard. You can see over on the right-hand side, all of these things still fall under sort of a passive learning situation. As soon as they get into something where they're more engaged, they have to participate in a discussion or give a talk in some way, they're more engaged, then it jumps up to 70%. And if they're involved in something even more complex, like a presentation of some sort or a simulation of a real experience, then it jumps up to 90%. So the more engaged they are, the more they learn, the more they remember. So it's just a useful concept. We talked about the learning cycle already, and that's really the idea of the learning cycle. Is it provides a pattern and a structure for you with specific activities that you can use to engage those learners, so that improves their learning, their learning in the training session. Some of the strategies that you can use for engaging learners, just kind of in general, And these are things that you can vary as you decide how you want to modify the activities, is using a variety of group sizes. Do some things as individuals, some things as pairs, some things as small groups, and some things as large groups. That helps students engage and talk with other learners, and even those discussion things, as we saw on the cone of learning. Use a variety of strategies to facilitate discussion, right? So you can have kind of a group discussion. You can divide people into groups, again, for the discussion parts of it. There's different ways that you can do that. If you're in a virtual setting like this, you could have a discussion board. You could have a chat discussion. There's many things that you could do. Use more than one format for learner response. Okay, you've had a couple of opportunities already to write something on our Padlet boards. You've been a little quiet on the speaking front, but having different opportunities for ways that learners respond can be helpful with engagement as well. Using the student learning plans is another engagement strategy. So as you're planning for your training, this is where we're kind of going with this. You have the teaching plan and all of those resources to work from. But depending on your training situation, you have to think through more specifically what you're going to do. That teaching plan is kind of a general plan that could be used under many circumstances, but every training situation is different, and you really need to think through specifically how you're going to facilitate those activities, particularly the engagement activities, because you've got to be thinking about a number of things. How many people are in your group? What's the setup of the training and things like that? So we are going to focus for the rest of the session on using a planning agenda approach to preparing to train. That way, when you get to actually delivering your training, you've got it well thought out, you're ready for that specific situation. You've made the changes that need to be made to adjust for your participants or your time frame, and you're hopefully ready for a smooth training situation. So if you already have a teaching plan, why do you need a planning agenda? Well, if you think about it, the teaching plan is kind of like a recipe. You could follow it exactly and it would probably work out great. But there might be reasons why you need to adapt it, either to meet your learners' needs or the parameters of the workshop that you're delivering. There are a lot of different types of scenarios that you could run into with the workshop. If you think about the activities that we're doing today as part of a virtual training, many of these activities are things I've done in face-to-face training before. Well, if you're going to do it virtually, that's a different situation. You've got to think about how you're going to modify activities. When you think about the group size, if you've got 8 to 10 people, that's a different situation than if you have 15 to 20 or even more than that. How will you manage that number of people? What type of a workshop is it? Is it a standalone workshop? Is it a group that has worked together over time, a group of learners who have been through multiple training sessions? Do you even know who's coming? or could you potentially have a lot of different types of participants in your group? Time is a really big one. How much time are you going to have, and how much control do you have over it? If you're sharing a training day with multiple people and you're late in the day, your 2 hours might end up being 45 minutes. So how are you going to adapt to that situation? And then there's the facility parameters. Most of the time, if you think about the sort of a typical training facility, you have tables, chairs, you can move things around, hopefully flip charts or whiteboards, things like that. But sometimes that's not the case. I had a situation once where I was doing a session as part of a conference. Luckily, I found this out a little bit ahead of time, but I turned out I was in like a lecture room where everybody was sitting in with the seats that go up and back. There was no way they could get up and move around. They had to be staying in their seats. So I had to adjust my plan a little bit to accommodate that. So as we get into the planning agenda, it's going to ask you questions like that. Now, you might not know at this point, but you're going to want to kind of envision what it might look like, because that impacts how you handle your activities. So if you don't have it already, you're going to want to get it from Podio, but there are two documents that we're going to be working with, because you're going to be doing another activity in just a minute. There's a planning agenda sample, which is all filled for LP1. And then there's a blank worksheet. All right. And you're gonna kind of take that blank worksheet and start to think about how you would plan and prepare for a training, and think about what that situation might look like. Again, you don't really know now, so you're gonna have to use your imagination a little bit, but you can start to think about what situation you might be in. All right. So if you think about the context, what kind of a facility would you be in? What type of a workshop would it be? Standalone, part of some other event? How many people do you think you would have? And who might they be? You know, what are their characteristics? With some of the training groups that we've had, there's some important considerations. Language is one, those types of things. So you want to be thinking about the who might be in your training session, and plan accordingly.